Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Fernando, and I welcome you to another of webinar series from Region 9. Before we get started, I would like to advise you that if you're having any trouble with your video or audio, please use the chat option of Zoom and send me a private message just to let me know that everything's working properly, or if you have any questions, feel free to direct them to me. The Q&A is specifically to communicate any questions or any comments you'd like to make to the presenter, so use the chat for any troubleshooting. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Neem Pomeranki, our presenter today, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Neve Pomeranki, as Fernando said, and I'm the owner of Seabright HR, and that's an HR consultancy offering a variety of HR services. And it's really great to be able to collaborate with Fernando and Ed on presenting to you guys. So I am familiar with Head Start because before I began consulting, I was HR director for a local large social services agency here in Santa Cruz County for a number of years. And it had a number of divisions, the largest of which was the Head Start one. So I'm very happy to be here this afternoon to review employee retention strategies. So as Fernando said, please do feel free to ask any questions as we go through. And then at the end, hopefully there'll be some time left for additional questions. And obviously, if you do think of something after the presentation, please feel free to reach out to me via email. So if we can proceed to the next slide, please, Fernando. So the purpose of today's training is to look at some retention strategies and allow you to think about whether there are any that you might be able to implement in your organizations. Next slide. So here's what the program looks like, beginning with the costs involved with high turnover and then moving through some things that you can consider implementing to improve retention. Next slide. So to start, the most important thing when it comes to retention is that it is a planned activity. It's not something that just happens. So if you don't have a plan to make employees stay, you won't be able to stop them from leaving. Again, it's just not something that will happen by itself. You do need to have an actual plan. Next slide, please. So one of the main worries at many organizations today is employee retention. And a recent survey found that 35% of executives said that it's actually their primary staffing concern. So whether retention is a big worry at your organization or not, losing even one good employee can have a negative impact. And obviously, the more critical the position, the higher the impact is going to be. Organizations that lose top performers don't only experience declines in productivity or an increase in customer service issues, they also experience a lowered knowledge base and morale problems. Plus, there are significant costs involved in replacing those employees who leave. Next slide, please. So with regard to the costs, depending really on what research you read, you'll find slightly different answers, but it seems to be that the median cost for an organization to replace an employee is between 16 to 21%. So, at the high end, they're around 1/5 of the employee's annual salary. Although when it comes to then higher level positions, it's even higher again. So you can see how quickly that can add up. If you take even the lowest earnings amount here on the table, $22,000 a year, assuming a 21% annual salary to replace, if 5 people earning that amount leave, then that's a total of over $23,000 in replacement costs, or just over one annual salary. So you can see how important having a retention plan in place is, because those costs really can build up quickly. Next slide, please. So here's a breakdown of the costs involved, and it includes both direct ones like advertising, or if you were to use one, the fee paid to a recruiter to find candidates for you. But it also includes indirect costs like lowered engagement or a drop in customer service, keeping in mind while there's always some kind of a price tag involved when any employee leaves, it's obviously going to be higher when it's a more valuable employee, because you can imagine how engagement and customer service ratings might actually improve if a negative employee leaves, or one who had poor customer service skills, for example. Oftentimes, training costs are calculated only to the amount that it takes to get the new employee productive, but they should actually include all the costs of getting the new employee to the same level of productivity as the employee who left, because that's the actual real cost of the person having left and needing to be replaced. So we can go to the next slide. It's the first poll question for you guys. So if you can please take a moment to answer, that would be great. Okay, great. So that's actually a 50-50 split of the number of respondents who replied. So it's really important that the managers and leaders in your organization do understand the cost, because oftentimes seeing a hard dollar amount gets the attention much more than just talking in general terms about how much turnover costs. Okay, thank you. So we can move to the next slide. So although retention is obviously a discussion about hanging on to your employees, at the same time, it's important to remember that some level of turnover in an organization is normal, and it's actually a good thing. So having very low turnover is not always necessarily something that you should aim for. And that's because very low rates, they often show that the organization is maybe overpaying for skills that could be cheaper somewhere else in the market. Or maybe it's because you're the only employer within your geographic area, which is fine as long as you're not hanging on to people who really shouldn't be there just because there's nowhere else for them to go, or because you find it difficult to recruit. Also, keep in mind that a stagnant workforce can't keep up with the pace of innovation, even in relatively slow changing industries. And a new set of eyes is always good. So overall, some turnover really is necessary. On the other hand, obviously, too much is also a problem. And when the rates are high, it typically means organizations are doing a poor job selecting the right employees. They're maybe failing to thoroughly onboard new hires, failing to provide a motivating work environment, or they're maybe losing out to employers that offer better pay and benefits. So next slide, please. So it's important to measure and track your turnover rates, but knowing those rates by themselves, that's just not any use without knowing what contributes to it and why those figures may be too high or too low, as the case may be. So assuming that you've analyzed your data and have come to the conclusion that you have high turnover, your next step is to try and determine why and when employees are leaving. So you can figure out the why by asking, questions at exit interviews, for example, where every employee who leaves is asked to complete one. And, you shouldn't forget to include, say, consultants if they've been in doing some work for you, because they see and hear a lot too. And keep in mind that you might not always hear the real reason why people are leaving, because some employees are going to be wary about burning bridges, but they are a helpful tool and better than not capturing any information at all, as long as you do something with the information and don't simply store it away in a file cabinet, because if that's the case, then there's no point at all in doing it. Next slide, please. So when it comes to looking at when employees are leaving, you should definitely be looking at your first year turnover rate, and then exploring things like your job advertisements to make sure that they're accurate and really showing what the job is like. And your candidate screening is also a good thing to look at. I actually always advise employers to apply for a job at their own organization, following every step that you ask of candidates, because you would be surprised at what you might learn from doing that, which can lead to significant improvements in the hiring process. You should also explore things like your onboarding process, because not having a solid onboarding program has been shown to drastically increase one-year turnover rates. You can also think about whether there are other organizations in your vicinity who hire for the same types of skill sets as you do, and whether your employees might be leaving for those employers once you've trained them. And if that's the case, you can maybe find out what that other employer offers that you don't, and see if you can make some changes to be able to more easily compete with that other employer. Next slide, please. So here's a recent survey giving a list of reasons that employees gave for having left their organizations. And it seems to prove the saying that employees don't leave organizations, they leave supervisors, because you can see in a list of 10 reasons, half are directly related to the supervisor. Now, with regard to compensation, while that is definitely important, employees need to feel that they're being fairly paid. Money is actually rarely the main reason that people leave their jobs. It definitely features in a number of studies and research that's carried out, but even when it does, it's rarely the top reason. Generally, if everything else about the workplace is good, being the best paid becomes relatively unimportant. So next slide, please. And again, yeah. So the fact that compensation isn't a primary reason that employees leave their job, that's good news for nonprofits, where different strategies are often needed, given the generally more limited budgets in comparison to the private sector. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do your best to ensure that your employees are financially secure and feel that they're being paid what they're worth. And that obviously to keep them happy, and that plays a part in engagement, which directly then relates to longevity. If your organization is budget restricted, be clear and upfront with employees about their compensation and the limits of the organization's funding. At the same time, you should make intentional decisions about what is realistic and responsible while prioritizing retention. When you simply just can't pay a competitive salary, that's the time that you need to get very, very creative with what you can offer your employees to keep them happy and engaged. And, see if you can't hang on to them that way. Next slide, please. So here now are some of the main reasons that employees stay with an employer. So if you can put some of these things in place, then the result will be increased employee engagement and then retention. Everything listed here is culture related, so it really is the critical factor, making these the types of things that you should be focusing on. If you remember the survey results, besides the various supervisor issues, Everything else on the list, apart from unavoidable reasons, was all to do with culture. Limited promotion opportunities, boring job duties, and work hours were all mentioned. So since nonprofits often pay lower than the private sector, you can see how important it is to create a great culture. And if you can do that, it will really go a long way towards retaining people, because a number of people who work for nonprofits are in it because of the mission. So they're willing to not be paid as much as they might be somewhere else if everything else about the job is good. So moving on to the next slide, which is another poll. Great. Thank you for responding. So of the people who responded, there's complete 100% agreement that a culture is something that is planned and not something that just happens. So if we can move on to the next slide. So building a culture, exactly as you guys just said, is a planned activity, and it shouldn't be left to chance. It really is important to work on building and retaining a culture that employees don't want to leave, as it is the number one thing nowadays that drives employee engagement and retention. And since people talk and post to social media, if you're a great place to work, it's also going to help with your recruitment efforts. So when it comes to what specifically affects culture, the short answer is everything. So it's things like the leadership, the management, the people who work there, the practices and policies, what's communication like, and the vision, mission, and the values. So they're all things that need to be looked at. Especially important is leadership, because culture just is not something that can happen in a vacuum. It has to start at the top with the full support of your agency leadership. If they're not on board, then no culture change initiatives are going to work. And, from the most basic policy changes through to the more significant overhauls of various practices that you might want to implement. Next slide, please. So to define your culture, you need to spend some time thinking about what your workplace is like now and what you want it to be in the future. And think about how every single thing is either contributing to or taking away from the culture that you want. It's always a work in progress, because it can and it will change over time. So it is something you do need to keep working on. So there are any number of ways to help you define it, like assessment tools and surveys, as well as observation, meetings, discussions, and interviews. And they can all help you gauge and help clarify it as well. Next slide, please. So we've already seen the impact of bad supervisors. So this just really is to reiterate that the number of surveys that have shown that no matter how high a salary is or how great the benefits are, employees who don't get along with their managers, who don't like or respect them, they will leave an organization if that manager is not supportive or is allowed to behave in an unhealthy way. Basically, if you don't have solid supervisors, it doesn't matter what else you try to put in place. It won't be enough to compensate for a poor manager. So it is really critical that organizations hold supervisors accountable and don't allow bad behaviors and practices to continue, no matter how valuable the supervisor may be in other ways or how long they've been with the organization. If they're impacting retention, which means the organization is incurring the related expenses, they're costing you too much. Next slide, please. So here are some of the things that bad supervisors do, and they need to be stopped if you're going to hang on to good employees. Every single one of these things are part of what makes up your culture, which, as we've already discussed, is critical. That's beyond any other single initiative that you introduce. It doesn't matter if you have great benefits or offer more time off than any of your competitors, for example. If there are silly rules in place and not enough support for employees from their supervisors, they're going to leave. If you don't lose them because, let's say, you're the only employer in your area, so people simply don't leave, then you're going to have unmotivated and unengaged employees, so you won't be getting the best from your workforce in any case. Next slide, please. So beyond ensuring that you have great supervisors in place, some of these things here are relatively quick solutions that you might explore putting into place. On the other hand, some will take longer to implement, particularly where there's more cost involved. But things like a casual dress policy or communicating the big picture, they cost nothing at all. And maybe exercise classes could be offered by setting up an agreement with a local gym, for example, by agreeing to have a minimum number of employees sign up at a reduced rate. Maybe you could look into seeing how much it would cost to have a yoga or mindfulness instructor come on site once a week. And then on-site health clinics could be available for free through your health insurance carrier. So that could also be something that might be worth looking into. So next slide, please, is another poll. So if you could all please take the time to respond, that would be great. Okay, so we have one person who thinks some of these things could be quickly implemented, and then another 4 who say that no, although you would like that to be the case, things just take a long time to move ahead. So yeah, I mean, I understand that. That's why I put that as one of the potential responses. I mean, maybe trying to communicate and starting to implement some of the things that are free. Communicating the big picture if you're not already doing that, acknowledging employees, their contributions, and on their anniversaries, obviously checking with employees first that that is something that they want, because there are employees who don't like to be publicly acknowledged, and something like a casual dress policy if that's something that would be pertinent to your organization. So next slide, please. So of the list of quick solutions we just looked at, I just wanted to talk a little about communicating the big picture, since it is an easy thing for organizations to start doing and it does cost nothing. And the reason I bring it up is because research consistently shows that it is so important to communicate the why or the purpose of your organization at every opportunity. And that's so that employees can find meaning in their daily work. So the purpose is the contribution that the organization and its employees make to society through their work. Keep in mind again that people who work for nonprofits are often primarily motivated by its mission. So it is important, because reminding employees then of how vital their work is will have real meaning for them. And when you communicate it regularly, they'll make an extra effort and go that extra mile and, take on additional tasks when they see the need. So none of this is about posters on the wall. Everyone should know where the organization is headed and where his or her place is in that big picture. It's important to start doing this if you're not already, because the tradition in most organizations is to not bother explaining the vision and the strategy to employees, which makes absolutely no sense, because the employees are the very ones who are supposed to then make things happen. Next slide, please. So here are some of the ways to communicate the big picture. And as you can see, it's more than just talking about it when there's an organization-wide meeting, although that's obviously a very good, quick place to start doing this. It's much more about intertwining this into your culture. And that means talking about it during one-on-ones between supervisors and employees, and also when setting individual goals, during conversations about the employee's job and how he or she helps achieve the company's mission and vision. During disciplinary conversations with an employee is another time. Let's say he or she left a child unattended for a couple of minutes. You can talk about your mission or values, which include, for example, the safety of children. In that case, you talk with the employee, obviously, about how leaving a child unattended is not only unsafe, but that it's also counter to your values. On the other hand, rewarding employees for a job well done should also be entwined with your mission. So if part of your mission or values is client retention, mention that during a conversation where you're rewarding the employee who did everything they could in a difficult situation to keep a client happy. Next slide, please. So moving on now to the importance of a robust onboarding program. So for most new hires, starting a job is nerve-wracking, but before they can settle in and make a difference, they need to understand what it takes to succeed in your organization. And that's where an effective onboarding program comes into play, because a good one educates and engages employees so they can quickly become productive and feel successful. As I already mentioned, research has consistently shown that a mediocre onboarding experience directly impacts employee turnover, especially during the first year. So it's important to ensure your new hires are made to feel welcome, as well as allowed to learn your organization's way of doing things, so they can become productive as soon as possible and feel like they're making a difference. So despite the initial cost involved in revamping an onboarding process, the return on investment makes it well worth the effort, because in the long run, it can save an organization thousands of dollars by cutting the turnover rate. Next slide, please. So you often hear the words onboarding and orientation used interchangeably, but they're actually quite different. Orientation is just one facet of onboarding. It falls under the umbrella of onboarding, and it's typically seen as a few hours long, or maybe a 1 to 2 day meeting describing the history and the mission of the organization, teaching employees about company rules, going over benefits and getting the benefits and other new hire paperwork completed. It often, though, ends up as an information overload type situation, leaving people reeling with the amount of data they're receiving, most of which they're not going to remember as it's just too much too soon. So that focus on paperwork, along with these other things listed here, are the typical pitfalls of most orientation programs. Next slide, please. So in comparison to orientation, onboarding is a minimum 90-day process of orienting and integrating a new hire into your organization so they can get up to speed as fast as possible, feel welcome, and deliver results as effectively as possible. In other words, it's about developing the behaviors that are going to be the foundation of an employee's long-term success at your organization. So the items listed here are the things that make up a successful onboarding program, and it obviously includes the first day orientation portion. So whatever you decide to include or not, don't forget to measure what you're doing. So compare your turnover and engagement levels before changing anything, and then do that regularly as you update and improve things over time. So next slide, please. It's another poll question. Okay, thank you for responding. So some of you do have a robust onboarding program, so that's great. I mean, the good news is that you all have some kind of a new employee orientation. So if you don't have a full onboarding program, those of you that just have the orientation, if you can maybe start working towards that, because you really will find that it's going to make a difference. I mean, obviously, if you're looking at your turnover rates and seeing that you are losing employees during that first year of employment. Next slide, please. So tuition reimbursement programs where, as you all know, the employer agrees to finance all or part of an employee's tuition. I mean, that might be something you could consider, even though, you know, it can sometimes be difficult to decide whether or not it's the right thing for your organization, since employees obviously benefit hugely from a reduction in tuition costs or even an elimination of tuition costs, depending on the specifics that you put in place. But given that cost, you have to ask whether it's worth it for employers. And the answer is that tuition reimbursement programs have been shown to definitely lead to a reduction in employee turnover. So if you decide that it is something you would like to do, typically a contract would be signed between the employer and the employee, and that's where the employee agrees to stay with the organization for a set period of time, usually around 2 to 5 years. And then that's for the length of time after the organization has financed their education. And then if the employee decides to leave before that time is up, they become responsible for paying on their own, and potentially, depending on what sort of a contract you have in place, potentially pay back any money that has already been paid to them. Next slide, please. So you can see that there are a number of other advantages. So if you do some calculations, you may find that the cost is less than what you might gain from offering it. And don't forget, you can start small and see how it goes and if it makes a difference. And again, just to repeat what I just said, as with any initiative that you implement, it's important to measure any impact that a new initiative is having or not. Because if you introduce something and it's not improving things, then there's no point spending the time continuing to do it. Next slide. So of all of the various ways that there are of reducing turnover, mentoring is one of the most effective, cost-efficient ways of increasing employee tenure. In fact, starting a mentoring program, it might be the closest you'll ever get to an organizational decision that has only positive impact. It's something that can improve employee satisfaction and retention. It enriches new employee initiation to your organization, makes your organization more appealing to candidates, and it trains your leaders. And it's free, it doesn't cost anything. So the biggest benefit of providing a mentor is having someone that the mentee can meet with to ask questions. The mentor can be a sounding board and help to sort out options and give advice on various organizational matters. Next slide, please. So when it comes to developing a mentoring program, the first step is to define what your objective is. If you're aiming for higher retention rates, then your program will obviously be structured differently than if you're trying to develop leaders, teach a specific skill, or welcome new hires into your organization. You can be flexible with the setup of the mentoring sessions. Some organizations use group mentoring, others use peer mentoring, some bring in an expert for facilitated mentoring, but the most common type is one-to-one pairs. But if there are more mentees than there are available mentors, you could put the mentees into groups with 2 mentors as facilitators. That would just depend on the number of people interested. In terms of making the match, there are actually algorithms that organizations can buy from vendors that are used to match mentors and mentees. Some companies use a random process for matching, like picking names out of a hat, but really a program where the participant has some input is usually the most successful. Lastly, don't forget, as you get ready to send people off to work in their mentor-mentee groups, it's a good idea to help them learn what mentoring actually means first. So you will need to provide some training just to ensure that it's the most successful that it can be. Next slide, please. So employee development is critical when it comes to retention, and that's where succession planning comes in. As you all know, it's a process for identifying and developing new leaders internally who can replace old leaders when they leave the organization for whatever reason. So most succession planning focuses on the most senior position, and in a nonprofit, that's typically the executive director. But it's actually important to include all of your key positions. And those are those positions that are crucial to the successful operation of your organization. And because of skill, seniority, or experience, are going to be tough to replace. Now, something that's very critical is that there is a clear understanding for all employees that a succession plan is not a guarantee of a position. Instead, it's a development plan, and it's to prepare an individual just in case any opportunities should become available within the organization at some point. It also needs to be clear to employees that planning for the future like this doesn't mean that if the time comes, the organization is going to rely exclusively on internal talent, because a good plan is generally going to include a combination of training and developing existing staff, plus the external recruitment. So again, transparent communication is vital when you develop a plan, and that's just so employees you're preparing for potential roles are absolutely clear and know that there are no guarantees. Next slide, please. So the place to start is to examine the skill sets in your organization today, as well as assessing future needs. You also need to be aware of your employees' career plans and the upcoming retirement rates within your organization. So with regard to assessing career plans, that's something that can happen by training your managers on how important it is for them to regularly have development conversations with their employees. Get to know them, what are their long-term goals, and are there any skills that they would like to develop? And these conversations can be a part of the regular one-to-one meetings that every manager should be having with his or her direct reports. Another important decision for organizations is whether the succession plan at your organization is open to all employees, or is it only for those identified as high performers by their managers. Overall, in terms of creating a great culture, I would say that succession planning and succession management, it should be a flexible system and oriented towards employee development and not a rigid list of high performing employees and the slots that they might potentially fill. So by blending succession planning and leadership development, you get the best of both worlds, which is the attention to the skills required for senior management positions, along with an educational learning system that can help managers develop those skills for their employees. Additional skill building is almost always required when you're looking at succession planning. It's not enough to just promote the next person in line, even though they may have been at the executive level. And this is because the skill sets required for the new potential role, it's more than likely very different to what's required in the person's current role. Promoting someone without preparation is just setting the person up for failure, but it is surprising how frequently that happens. Next slide, please. So some of the advantages for an employer are listed here. Not only does having a succession plan in place make sure that the employer is prepared and able to support service continuity when people in key positions leave, but employees feel valued since you're supporting their development, and that's a huge part of a positive culture. And this is the case even if there's no guarantee that they'll ever attain the higher position. From the employer's perspective, you have a high performing, engaged employee because you're developing them. And even though an employee may leave and get a higher level position because of the training you've provided them with, well, that's the risk. Even though the higher performing engaged employee that you had before they quit typically balances things out, which is why it's a win-win for both the employer and the employee. So next slide, which is another poll. So if you could please answer, that would be great. Okay, so 5 of you responded, so thank you to you 5. And overall, it seems like it's mixed, that you have some documentation of processes. So, you know, if succession planning is something that you would like to start looking into, begin discussing with your leadership, if you don't have already something in place, this is a good place to at least begin, is to gather the information, because the biggest loss for an organization when people start retiring, if you don't think about it, the brain drain, the information that you lose when those people walk out the door. So this is a really good thing to just start doing, is have people begin documenting their processes. Some organizations use a centralized intranet portal. It doesn't even have to be that, just to get it going, as long as it's the information. It can be a Word document saved to a network where people are going to have access to it. But it really is critical to make sure that you're getting the information that's just going to make things easier when someone leaves. Next slide, please. So flexible work schedules are also something that might be worth exploring in your organizations. And that's because flexibility has become very important to a large number of employees nowadays. Now, of course, a work from home option isn't something that's suitable for every position, like a teacher or a receptionist, or, I mean, really any customer or client facing position. But it might be something that's worth considering for other roles in your organization. Maybe ask yourself whether something like flex time, part time, or job sharing, for example, could potentially work for jobs where working from home isn't feasible. Or maybe you decide you don't want anyone working from home, but you can offer various flexible schedules instead. So when implementing this type of policy, employers do struggle with fairness when only certain employees can work remotely, but transparent communication can go a long way towards helping employees understand, and particularly if there are other options available besides work from home. Now, something I haven't listed here is an alternative work week schedule, or a compressed work week, which is any regularly scheduled work week that requires an employee to work more than 8 hours in a 24-hour period, like a 410 or a 980 schedule. And the reason I haven't listed it is because in most states, while it's possible to implement it, in California, it absolutely is not. Even if an employee requests it, there are a number of steps that must be followed, including a vote, and then actually recording the outcome of the vote with the Department of Labor. So I just wanted to mention why I hadn't got it here, in case anyone was wondering. Next slide, please. So there are a number of advantages in allowing flexible schedules, and some of them are listed here. Now, obviously, even though there are clear advantages, there are a number of things that need to be considered when planning to implement a policy like this. And that's beyond figuring out what jobs might work with a flexible arrangement and not. And those are things like, what type of flexible working arrangements will suit your organization? How will you deal with meetings on days that someone has already left or is working from home? Is your IT setup something that would allow work from home, if you decide work from home is something that you do want to be able to offer? And just generally, if there are obstacles, whether there are ways to overcome them. So overall, the advantages generally outweigh the disadvantages, and a good manager can handle the disadvantages. So again, flexible scheduling really has become part of what employees are looking for as it becomes more and more popular, meaning that if your competitors offer it, then there's a higher chance that you could lose employees to them. So next slide, please. So here's a summary of what we've looked at during the presentation. I hope that you find some of the things discussed useful, and maybe you might be able to implement some of them in your organizations. So with that, we've reached the end of today's presentation. Thank you for having participated. And before we get to any questions that you may have, I just wanted to ask you to complete the evaluation that you will be receiving via email in the next few days, because if you take the time to respond to that, it really helps us, because the feedback you provide gives us some ideas on areas of interest for you, to you. And then if we can just move to the last slide, please. I just wanted to take a minute to remind you of the upcoming in-person event in San Diego. And that's going to be on August 9th. And it's the Summit Networking event. And it's going to include a 60 to 90 minute training on effective recruiting practices. But that's just part of a much larger agenda, which is also going to feature a discussion on the Region 9 HR network, and specifically the online communication forum led by Ed. There's going to be a discussion on coaching and learning organizations by Christine Matos of Masterful Strategies, and it's going to conclude with a hot topics panel and closing remarks by Bill Donaldson of the Unified Insurance Agency, and that's a Region 9 Head Start Board of Directors member. So feel free to let your Head Start colleagues know about the event, if you believe that they could benefit from it, so beyond, just Region 9. So with that, we do have a few minutes remaining, and if there are any questions, please feel free to ask them. And again, if you think of something afterwards, or we don't have time to get to it today, please do feel free to email me.
At this point, I will open the Q&A. If any of you have any questions for Neve, please go ahead and send a Q&A message. If not, I'd like to thank you again for joining us today. I'd like to thank Neve for her time and for her help with the presentation. Also, the PDF of the PowerPoint will be available at our website, the Region 9 website, as well as a recording of the webinar. If you'd like to revisit some of Neve's information, will be available shortly at our website as well. If there are no questions, I would like to thank Neve again. Thank you, everybody, and I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.